Now that we've seen how labor demand helps to determine wages, let's understand the labor supply and how labor supply affects wages. If you had few skills, what would you want to do to earn an income? So if you were really a lower skilled person, how could you earn higher income? Would you be willing to clean septic tanks? And why would somebody who cleans septic tanks earn more than somebody who works, say, gardening with basically the same skills? Why is it that ceteris paribus, holding everything else constant, why is it that jobs few people want to do pay more than jobs many people want to do? Why is it that, again, ceteris paribus, holding everything else constant, jobs with more prestige pay more than jobs with low prestige? And again, are you willing to work at night, in the cold, in remote area, longer hours? These are all things that help to determine wages, as well as the marginal revenue product of labor, which was our demand curve. So labor supply is determined by your trade-off with leisure. Again, if you are looking at an upward sloping supply curve for your labor supply services, it's because you're trading off labor and leisure. So let's look at the far left. You'd be pretty low down on that labor supply curve in terms of wage. You're willing to work for less money. And the reason for that, if you're sitting around doing nothing for 24 hours a day, the marginal value of another hour of leisure is very low. The opportunity cost of working is very low. Therefore, you're willing to work for fewer dollars. Now, as you move up and you start working 15, 16 hours, then the marginal value of leisure is very high. The opportunity cost of working is much higher, and I need to pay you more to get you to work an additional hour. And that's why we have an upward sloping labor supply curve. Shifts in labor supply, again, where the labor supply will be positioned along that any given demand curve, is based on the skills needed for a particular job and the number of people willing and able to do that job. So if there are few people who are willing to do a job, you're going to be higher up on that labor. There'll be, I guess, a reduced labor supply curve, so you're higher up along the demand curve than a job where you have many people willing to do a job, or the number of skills required. Doctors will be higher up on that labor demand curve because there are fewer people willing to go through the rigors of becoming a doctor than, say, someone willing to become a carpenter. You have different skill sets, and the more difficult it is to obtain those skill sets, the fewer workers are able to do it, and you're higher up on the labor demand curve. And we call these compensating differentials, especially when you look at things like attractiveness of a job, the risk, and we'll get to these in a minute. But compensating differentials mean I have to pay you more to take on these different attributes. Government regulation that bars new entrants that keep wages artificially high. So licensing means fewer people can enter a profession. That means the labor supply is actually lower than what it would be. So you're higher up on a demand curve and you can earn more money. So when we look at things like becoming an undertaker, that takes more skills. Plus you might have to be certified, and therefore there are fewer people who you'd be competing with. And lastly, elasticity of supply for labor is based on the alternative opportunities you have. What other things could you be doing with your labor services? The more opportunities or alternatives you have, the more elastic your labor supply curve, the more narrowly defined is your skill set, the more inelastic is your demand curve. Your supply curve. The more inelastic is your supply curve. So what you really want to have is many alternatives. Therefore, if somebody tries to lower your wage, you can go somewhere else. If you have a really inelastic labor supply curve, it means I can keep lowering your wage and you'll still stay with me. So we look at any given labor demand curve. We'll use this one here. And here is the pretty inelastic labor supply curve. This is somebody who doesn't have many alternatives. We'll also say there are a lot of people who can do this job. Therefore, the wage is not that high relative to someone here who has a very elastic labor supply curve, and there are far fewer people who can do that skill set. Therefore, they're higher up on that labor demand curve. So the teal color is somebody with very, very unique skills that are highly valued, and they have many, many alternatives, whereas the fuchsia supply curve is somebody with a lot of skills. There are a lot of people with these skills, or people who can do these skills, and they're not really adaptable to many other things. So you get a really narrowly defined degree, then you're going to have a more inelastic supply curve than somebody with a more skills that are adaptable to other things. We might look at somebody in the fuchsia color, somebody not willing to move from a certain area, whereas somebody with a fuchsia supply curve is willing to move all over the country or even the world, that gives them a more elastic supply curve because they have more alternatives. So starting with the same situation, we'll use the fuchsia demand curve here now, and the teal demand curve, and now we'll add the fuchsia demand curve. This is now a good way of explaining two different types of people and two different skill sets. So with the fuchsia, you have a very, very elastic demand curve. The employer has many, many alternatives than workers. I might have other machines I can place you with, or there are many other, I might offshore, whatever it is. That is a more elastic demand curve. It could also be there's a really elastic demand curve for the product that's being produced, and therefore there's going to be elastic demand curve for the labor that produces that product. Whereas the teal demand curve, it's a very, very inelastic demand curve. That employer does not have many alternatives, therefore it can't do a whole lot in terms of, it can't replace the worker, and it needs those workers. So if you look at something like a very, very highly qualified NBA player, LeBron James, there's a very, very inelastic demand curve for his labor services. With the labor supply, there are many, many people in the fuchsia supply color, the fuchsia supply curve, many people who could do this job, and they have a very narrow skill set. So they have a very, very inelastic supply curve of their labor services, and they're far to the right because more people can do it, and they're therefore going to have a much lower wage than somebody in the teal supply curve, who again, they have a very, very unique skill set. It's highly valued, and they have many, many alternatives. So if you try lowering their wage down, just a small bit, they'll go find something else and go somewhere else, and that's why they have a more elastic labor supply curve. We can look at different things such as window washers on a high-rise versus people willing to wash the windows on a strip mall. There are a lot of risk factors that are, as you can see from the picture, washing windows on, say, a 25-story building. Therefore, fewer people are willing to do it. They're going to earn a lot more money than, say, somebody who washes windows on a strip mall. We might look at this in terms of a pediatric oncology nurse versus a nurse in a maternity ward. Fewer people are willing to deal with the stress of dealing with kids with cancer, whereas snuggling little babies is always beneficial and fun, and therefore there are more people willing to do that. So that would be more along the fuchsia supply curve. And we can look at this in many different ways. We can look at, say, a president of a university has very unique skills that aren't easily replicable. It's harder for people to do those. And they're actually competing with somebody who, say, works in food services. And so therefore they're competing with those people. So even though there may not be 10 million people currently in that profession, there are many, many people who could do it, and so they're implicitly competing, whereas few people are competing with, say, a college president or LeBron James. LeBron James could do many, many different things. Very few people could do what LeBron James does. So when we look at compensating differentials, jobs with more risk, this would be people, very few people are willing to take this, therefore they would be more in the teal supply curve. Jobs that incur, putting people at risk, their lives are in danger, even within the elements. Jobs with less prestige. If you want a job that's, people look down on, they're going to have to compensate me in order to take that job relative to, again, holding skills constant. Unpleasant elements, being out in the cold, having to move to a really remote area, that would be unpleasant elements. Unpleasant and longer hours. People who are willing to work more than 12, 15 hours. Less flexible scheduling. And by the way, going back to the unpleasant and longer hours, there's a huge difference in going from 6 hours a week to 8 and 10 hours a week in terms of income. It's very, very disproportionate. Just making that 40-hour week barrier increases your income considerably. Those who are willing and able to work, say, 12 to 16 hours a day are going to get paid a whole lot more because they're willing to work those longer hours. Less flexible scheduling. If you want to have a schedule that's got a lot of flexibility, lets you come and go as you please, well, that's going to be far less. You have a very, very flexible schedule. You're going to make a lot less money than somebody has to be at specific places at specific times. More skills. Why should you take more math? Why should you take more rigorous courses? These are really important. These develop your skills, and fewer other people are doing it. They're not able to compete with you on these jobs. Having more skills is very, very important. Increased credentials. having to pass the bar or the CPA, or ways of keeping competition out. Therefore, people who have these skills are going to have higher incomes than people who don't, because they're higher up on that labor demand curve. Jobs with more stress. There are certain jobs that are very stressful. If you're handling other people's money and financial situation, you're going to earn more money than somebody else assuming the same skills. Somebody who doesn't have to take on that risk. Jobs at business entrepreneurs. This is why entrepreneurs do make more money, holding in everything else constant, and should. They take on more stress. They're up in the middle of the night having to fix things. Jobs that require managing people have more stress, and therefore they earn more money. So these are the compensating differentials that shift the labor supply curve from one area on a demand curve to another, and these are the skills that actually give you higher wages.